should a constitutional post holder get back into a kind of an operational or a non-operational role in the country's largest listed bank. You have Reserve Bank of India. For the last 7 years, you have an IAS officer in charge and a retired civil servant. So the banks, the financial sector entities, the corporate sector, they get the message. And for example, you have to get hold of a technology approval. Now you have to go to Directorate General of Technical Development, and they have to stand in queue, and that the bureaucrat will sit. Then you go into the Ministry of Industry. So it is not just a permission, but also permission of how much you can produce.
Would you say the GST has been an economic success?
It has been economic success, but it could have been far better if some of those issues that we discussed.
Do you think GST has been an administrative success?
I don't think it has been an administrative success the way it was intended to be.
35 years since 1991. Who really runs the Indian economy? Is it the entrepreneurs, the politicians, or the bureaucracy?
There is a strong correlation between the politician and the civil servants, and they run the economy. Off and on, you will keep hearing that one entrepreneur, a very powerful entrepreneur, has an influence of the way the government takes decisions. Now, these are all, I would say, rumors.
Hello and welcome to Macro Matters, Business Standard's fortnightly podcast on all things related to the Indian economy. Hi, I'm Ankur Bharadwaj. 35 years after the 1991 reforms, India is a very different economy. Markets are more open, private enterprise has flourished, Indian companies now compete globally. Yet, a series of recent developments, from Rajiv Kumar's appointment as HDFC Bank chairman to debates around quality control orders and GST completing 9 years, raise an interesting question. 35 years after liberalization, has the Indian state changed as much as the Indian economy? Or to put it another way, who really runs the Indian economy? Joining me once again is A.K. Bhattacharya, one of India's most respected commentators on economics and public policy. Through decades of reporting, writing, and analysis, he has helped explain how India's economy, its institutions, and its policy making intersect. AKB, welcome back to Macro Matters.
Thank you, Ankur, for having me here.
As we began planning for this episode, we realized that Rajiv Kumar's appointment as part-time chairman of HDFC Bank for a period of 3 years is important not only because of the individual involved, who has been a secretary with the Government of India, an IAS, and also the former Chief Election Commissioner, but also because it reflects a broader trend. We find that across manufacturing, across consulting, telecom, banking, finance, a lot of these positions are now filled by former civil servants who, after having retired, take up these boardroom positions. It raises a very interesting question. Are these corporates valuing their experience? Is it just because of the experience, or because of their understanding of the Indian state and how it functions?
Well, we need to set the whole thing in context. First of all, what is happening now, or the reference that you made to the appointment of the former Chief Election Commissioner, Rajiv Kumar, as the HDFC Bank chairman, non-executive part-time chairman for 3 years, is a part of a larger trend. It is not for the first time that a former civil servant or a retired civil servant has been hired to head a leading bank, although non-executive position. This has been going on for some time. The fact of the matter is that this was pre-reform of 1991, and one thought that this will go away, but it has not gone away. You will recall what happened to Hyundai. Hyundai were trying to expand its operations in India, taking on the country's largest automotive company. So in 2007, they hired a former finance secretary who was just got retired after having presented a budget in 2007-8. They have him as the president of the company. Uh, Clearly, the corporates and the banks' love for civil services, civil servants, retired civil servants, to be in key positions has not gone away. And that reflects a larger trend, which is that the governance structure is still very much influenced, controlled by the presence, intervention, and somebody will say even interference of the steel frame. So I think it's a larger trend of what's really happening. This particular appointment of Mr. Rajiv Kumar raises other issues that should a constitutional post holder should get back into a kind of an operational or a non-operational role in the country's largest listed bank.
So, for somebody who has been a secretary in the government of India, that person has spent 3 to 4 decades in government. So one could argue and one could make a case that they understand governance, regulation, policy making, the secretariat, etc., and even regulation to a large extent. But the other interpretation is that 35 years later, the Indian state itself continues to occupy the most important, the most central position in the Indian economy, and unfortunately in the Indian corporate sector as well.
Well, something else has happened. No, you are right. What was one of the key elements of India's economic reforms in the 1990s? That the government will not be in the business of running businesses. That's number one. Number two, the government will decide the policy, but the implementation of the policy, the enforcement of the policy will be left to independent regulators. So when you are allowing the private sector to come and have a free play in areas which were reserved by the state earlier, which is the pre-industrial licensing 1991 phase, the idea was that the private sector in these areas need to be regulated. So you had the idea that there will be independent regulation of these bodies. We did see quite a few independent regulatory system bodies created. You saw the Securities and Exchange Board of India was set up earlier, but was not given the constitutional teeth, which is the legal teeth. It became an act of parliament in 1993. It made SEBI the powerful body it is. You had the Telecom Regulatory Authority of India. Like this goes on, several other sectors. You had RBI already there. But what has happened in the last 35 years, that while the private sector has come into these sectors and facing competition of sorts, the regulatory system has been dominated by retired civil servants. What has happened is the government finds it very comfortable to have retired civil servants in charge of these regulatory bodies. So therefore, for many private sector entities, which are listed entities, they realize that if they have to operate in this environment, yes, they have to go to the ministers and to the bureaucrats for policy. But even to dealing with the regulators, they need to have somebody who is well versed with the way the government functions. So if you have the Securities and Exchange Board of India, which has had a retired civil servant since 2005, barring a short period of 3 years when it was not a private government servant, retired civil servant, you have an Insurance Regulatory Authority of India, which has got an IAS officer for the last 8 years. You have Reserve Bank of India for the last 7 years. You have an IAS officer in charge and a retired civil servant. So the banks, the financial sector entities, the corporate sector, they get the message. is that you need to have somebody in the system who can connect with these regulators as well. So today, you're talking about 35 years of reforms. My sense is that today the private sector is not required to deal with the government and the government system, not only from a policy perspective by meeting the minister or the secretary to the department, but also to deal with a regulator who happens to be a former civil servant. So it makes sense to have a non-executive part-time chairman of your company who can deal with the regulatory body with greater understanding, maybe some equation, maybe they were former colleagues in some department. The steel frame is a fascinating sector in a sense that if I were your senior and if I am of a certain batch, whatever may be your seniority or your position, I will still maintain a kind of equation with you. So if I'm not saying that the regulator will do something wrong, but doors can be opened far more easily. That is what has really happened.
Some people would say that, this happens across different countries, not just India, that public servants can go into the private sector. But in India, public servants are generalists. They are not necessarily field matter experts, maybe not even in the economic sense of the thing, right? So if they're generalists, they could argue that because we have such broad experience, such wide experiences across the country in different fields, this experience itself is valuable. While the other side would argue that, in a more market-driven economy, bureaucratic expertise would not be valued so much. So maybe the government is using the steel frame to cage animal spirits of the Indian industry.
No, I would not, say that. But I think you gave a very good example of the international, what practice is. Internationally, there's a two-way stream. There are government guys who get into the private corporate sector. They also become regulators. But the private guys also come into the government. They become secretaries. And they also become regulators. So it's a two-way street. But in India, I think it has become largely a one-way street. Not that the government did not try. You will remember in 2024, the government did try to open up 35 key positions in the government to private sector. Now what happened to that? That move was stopped because there was a huge amount of protest from the civil servants. That, oh, how can you, take away my key positions of promotional avenues? And that proposal is yet to be revived. So therefore, it is important for a thriving economy like ours to have this system to work both ways. That yes, government guys should go out into regulatory bodies and private sector, but similarly, private sector guys are professionals. What stops a former banker to be the RBI governor? What stops an economist, which till recently there were two economists who were the RBI governor, Raghuram Rajan and Urjit Patel. And unfortunately, the government had a problem with both those private economists, Urjit Patel as well as Raghuram Rajan. There were some issues that arose. So the government realized that probably a civil servant is a better bet. So I think this is where the problem arises, that the private sector realizes that it is important for them to have a civil servant as the non-executive chairman to deal with the ecosystem.
So I want to be careful here because this is not an argument against the civil services. I mean, I'm sure many important reforms in this country have been undertaken
they are very competent people.
Yeah.
They go through a very hard selection process.
So this is not an argument against their capability or their competence.
Of course not.
But should so much influence lie with only one administrative cadre in the country?
Well, there have been talk about reforming this cadre. It's a powerful cadre, and there have been many committees, not one, which suggested that you are getting generalists, but give them an opportunity to specialize. So there was this one committee which suggested that at age 40, every IAS officer will have the option of choosing a stream, so that in the next 20 years he specializes in that area. Now we are yet to see the implementation of that idea. There was this idea of in Mrs. Gandhi's time, even before Mrs. Gandhi's time, the idea of industrial management pool, wherein you will get the private sector experts to come in and join the government at the level of additional secretary and secretaries. What happened to Lavraj Kumar? What happened to Vijay Kelkar? So there were moves earlier to get the private sector talent into the government and to add that, introduce the specialization skill. There were economists who came out from the private sector who joined the finance ministry on the UPSC appointments and spent their entire career. But we don't get to see them. One, that they come in for short-term contracts, 3 years, 4 years, then they move away. But so the government's civil services themselves have not become specialized enough. So that is a shortcoming in my view, and that needs to be addressed.
Whenever we discuss the Indian economy, we talk about entrepreneurs, we talk about markets, we talk about companies, right? We often don't talk about the underlying system, the administrative state. Maybe we should focus a little more on the administrative state, which is running all of this, which is invisible but also kind of omnipresent.
No, it is not invisible. It is very much visible in my view, and the civil servants run this government. As I said, they are an efficient lot. They're competent. They're chosen through a rigorous process. They're some of the best minds this country produces. But on the question of reform, I think we have a long distance to cover. As you said, specialization, number one. Number two, getting the private sector guys to come in and play their role in the governance structure, just as the government civil servants can go out and spend some time in the private sector. So there has to be easy, flow in and flow out of talent from the private and the public sector. The problem is, if you don't do that, then there is a tendency you will see, as we are seeing now in the private sector, to go in for retired civil servants, to have them in some key ornamental position, because they will help connect with people in the government because of the cadre-based services that you have. If you have hypothetically, if you have the former Chief Election Commissioner as the HDFC Bank chairman, now if the RBI approves that position, then Mr. Rajiv Kumar will find easier access to many regulators in the financial sector right now, far more easily than any other private sector guy who will be the chairman or the part-time chairman of this bank. I mean, whether it is the insurance regulator, who is a retired IAS officer, the capital market regulator is a retired IAS officer. You have the banking regulator, RBI governor, who is not retired. He is still, he was part of the government service, but he quit, and he is now the RBI governor. So this is the reason why the private sector is doing it. My sense is that it will be not fair to blame the private sector. We also need to understand why the private sector is doing it. Now, hypothetically, what would have happened if the government decides, say, listen, I want to create a body of experts from the private sector who can be my future regulators. Now, it can say that let them be my talent pool. Now, why should they be only occupied by the civil servants? Now, why is it that all your regulators will have to be and
Yes.
IAS officers. Whether it is the Telecom Regulatory Authority of India Limited, or whether it is the pension fund is not there right now, but insurance, capital markets, central bank. So I think there's something which needs to be deeply thought.
As we're discussing, one thought keeps coming back to me. Perhaps we have been asking the wrong question all these years. We've been asking whether India has liberalized the economy. Maybe the more interesting question would have been, has India liberalized the way the state interacts with the economy? Maybe that is where the problem is. And now I want to ask you a direct question here. 35 years since 1991, who really runs the Indian economy? Is it the entrepreneurs, the politicians, or the bureaucracy?
Well, entrepreneurs certainly not as a class. Off and on, you will keep hearing that one entrepreneur, a very powerful entrepreneur, has an influence of the way the government takes decisions. Now, these are all, I would say, rumors. We cannot say that as a class they run the government. Neither politicians nor the civil servants run the government. It is a combination of the politician and the bureaucrat who run this government. And there is desirable, I would say, there is a strong correlation between the politician and the civil servants. They have to work together, and they run the economy. They take those important decisions. The problem is that when they extend their reach beyond policy making, even though you have liberalized the economy, you have said that I will make the policy as the government, and I will let the sector to be regulated by independent bodies. Then it is important to maintain that independence through not by sending or allowing your former civil servants to go and occupy those positions. I think a debate needs to take place in this country where we say that what should be the cutoff point for a former civil servant, a retired civil servant, to come and occupy a regulatory position. There was this practice earlier, Ankur, that somebody who has held a constitutional position who will never occupy any other job in the government system. Now, I think that was breached many, many years ago when the 11th Chief Election Commissioner of India, Mr. M.S. Gill, decided to be a politician, joined Rajya Sabha, became the minister in Manmohan Singh government. Now, it was allowed. Now, there have been many even Supreme Court judges. Now they are, after the term is over. So I think we need to review this system, that to what extent the retired civil servants, retired people who have held constitutional positions should be taking up positions in the government system. We need a debate in this country and a proper discussion on this.
AKB, let's step back for a moment. And, when we talk about the 1991 reforms, what comes to mind is liberalization, markets, competition, private enterprise. But if I were to ask you today, or somebody else to ask you today, what was the change that 1991 reforms brought about? How would you answer that today?
Well, 1991 changed the way industries could do business. The government role was minimized. You had a industrial licensing system which was virtually scrapped. You had public sector entities which were allowed to operate and the sectors were reserved for them. Now they were all scrapped. So I think the space for the private sector to operate in the economy was certainly a major decision that was taken, quite apart from the fact that you created a regulatory system But in the course of the last few decades, what we have seen is some of those basic tenets or the principles of those reform principles have been diluted.
The reason I'm asking this question today is because I think there were two broad ideas at play. One was to remove or reduce the government's role as a producer, and the second was to reduce the government's role as regulator slash administrator. The reforms probably delivered more on the producer part of it while ignoring the second aspect.
I would agree with you. The government withdrew itself from the business of doing business to a great extent because public sector was its complete monopoly in areas was abolished almost. But the government did not completely move away from either regulating or even monitoring the implementation of policies. The government should not have continued to do that. Government should have stayed out of the process of policy implementation. It should have just framed the policies. As a matter of fact, there are reports and committees in the government which exactly say this. But unfortunately, both the political leadership and the body of civil servants, when they sit together, they realize that I think those reforms will be too drastic for their continuation of their system that has gone on for the last several decades.
It's like, we have great ideas, somebody comes up with a great idea, and then suddenly the government runs into an episode of Yes Minister.
Sort of.
So, for younger viewers, can you help us understand what License Raj actually meant? If I was to trying to set up a factory in the 1970s or 80s, what kind of approvals would that entail?
Well, not one. There are many approvals. The most important thing was that you have to, for example, you have to get hold of a technology approval. Now you have to go to Directorate General of Technical Development, and you have to stand in queue, and that the bureaucrat will sit and in judgment over your proposal and everything, and then he'll give you clearance. But that will not mean you get a license. You get a technical approval. Then you go into the Ministry of Industry, and the Ministry of Industry says, "Oh, why do you want it?" Okay, fine, you allow. So it is not just a permission, but also permission of how much you can produce. I mean, if you overproduce, then you would be penalized. I mean, there was this famous case in the late 1970s or the early 1980s, where in one of his luncheon meeting, the famous G.D. Birla actually gave a clarion call to industry saying that please accept the punishment of going to jail, even if it means producing more than what you have been licensed to produce. So that was the one element of it. So that is what was done away with. The licensing was done away with, and that was a big change.
But India is clearly a very different economy today. Businesses can raise capital, they can invest and deal with the government in a different way. So clearly, we are not back to the economy of the 1970s or the 80s. Yet, entrepreneurs would assert that the challenge hasn't gone away. So previously, it was the license compliance License Raj which was the problem, and now it is the challenge of compliance.
Well, I think we have been very soft on this. I think compliance is not a bad idea. Compliance is good. But what has happened is licenses have made their re-emergence in different ways, different names. What is the core issue behind licensing? The core issue behind licensing is that somebody in a room, which may belong to a civil servant or to a political leader, will decide what you are likely to do in the sphere of economic activity. And that decision will not be rule-based or transparent. It will be based on the specific consideration that the person goes through and undertakes and says, okay, you are okay to go ahead and do it. So there is this element of discretion. It is not rule based, it is a discretion based. So we do see a lot of this re-emergence of discretion based policies coming back into the system.
So I'm going to put you under the spot here.
Yeah.
And I'm going to ask you a direct question and I want a short answer. In 1991, did India dismantle the license Raj or just simply replace it with the compliance Raj?
I think in 1991, the government did abolish license Raj and did introduce compliance thing, but its license are making a comeback through a different name.
And how do you decide when the administrative burden outweighs public benefit? This is the challenge between regulation. I mean, clearly, no large economy of this size can do away with regulation. Absolutely not. But still, there has to be balance between.
I think there has to be a balance, and ultimately, what you have to see is that whether that compliance burden is leading to productivity gains or not. Now, whether it is a question of quality enhancement, or whether it is a question of safeguards or safety regulations, I mean, these are all compliance requirements. I mean, people may defend the quality control orders in the name of safety and quality considerations, but we all know how those quality control orders, those 700 quality control orders, which were reduced to 500, have actually played out. India's MSME sector were the big sufferers because they could not import a large number of goods because of these quality control orders, and they were in the export business. And who gained? A few big industrial houses.
One of the phrases that this government loves is ease of doing business. And I'm sure some progress has been made in digitizing certain processes and making it easier for you to invest. So investing may have been made easier, but what about the ease of continuing to operate the business that you're invested in? I'm sure that they understand that those two are not necessarily the same thing.
Well, I think ease of doing business, as you rightly pointed out, has improved. But we've also seen how discretionary controls have made a return of sorts. And that is what is causing concern, whether it is even the idea of the productivity linked incentive scheme is, in my view, is a return of a discretionary system where a committee of officers or bureaucrats will decide whether your application has to be cleared or not. Now, the latest committee that is being set up to look into the desirability of continuing quality control orders is also something similar. Now, what is the committee doing? Committee is not going to decide that we don't need these quality control orders. Committee will decide that whether you need the exemption or not. In other words, it will be just the reverse of what should have been. That if you are coming under the restrictive category from the quality control order point of view, then you continue to remain. You come in to check with me whether you need to be exempted or not. In other words, everybody needs to be barred except those who come and whom I give clearances. Now, that to my mind is a very perverted way of allowing industries to do their businesses.
So it's like saying, show me the man and I'll show you the rule.
Yeah.
So basically, regulation is supposed to make it more objective for the regulator to implement, while the practice in India has been more subjective.
I mean, take it to an extreme logical extension. If we were to say that everybody in this room is actually guilty of a crime, and those who are not guilty of a crime, you come and get a certificate from me then no, you are not guilty of a crime. Now, this is exactly what is proposed to be done through this committee-based system of clearing exemptions from quality control orders. Instead of reducing the number of quality control orders as it was done from 500 to 700 to 500, and maybe doing it further down, because it is not going to improve your ease of doing business for a large number of MSMEs, and they account for over 90% of India's.
And once again, to reiterate, we are not objecting to better quality.
Of course not.
But
not safety regulations.
Yeah.
They should be.
But it's about using quality not as an objective, but as a policy tool.
Yes.
So it's probably a good time for us to explain to our readers or viewers as to what quality control orders really are.
Well, a quality control order is essentially used by the government to monitor what is coming into the country. Now, a few years ago, there were complaints. There's a lot of dumping that is happening from various countries, including China, and they were coming with quality specifications. They were not meeting the standards. So the government said that we will have these quality control orders, that those we are importing it or we are manufacturing it here must adhere to those quality standards. So the quality control orders. So on paper, the intentions were laudable, but the way it was implemented was, it essentially meant that each of those QCOs will have to, the manufacturer here or importer will have to adhere to them. Now, which meant that you go to the same building, the good old days in the 1980s, 70s, like Director General of Technical Development, you go to a building, the processes have been simplified of sorts, in a sense that there's an online application and everything. But once it goes there, the department of the government takes its sweet time, whether to grant it permission or not. But if you don't get the permission, you can't import it or manufacturing it. So it is, in the name of quality, you have ensured that those businesses whom you don't want to either import or produce actually will face a major difficulty. So I think the QCOs did a lot of damage to the backbone of the MSME sector.
So a debate about quality has again been converted into a debate about regulation. This is regulation by stealth in that case, right? So,
It is. It's also a return of a licensing regime in a different name.
Yes. Recently, Business Standard reported about the battery swap issue that the automobile industry has been facing. Would you like to tell our readers?
See, the thing is that it's a question of the life of a battery. Now, what is the life of a battery, whether it is 5 years, 6 years, 7 years, or 10 years? Now, again, the goal is very laudable, that you don't want a battery after it's used to be thrown out and add to environment pollution. Now, it's a very, very laudable goal, and it must be, we must do something by which we ensure that a used battery does not pollute our rivers and soil. But the question that comes to our mind is that whether those norms were fixed keeping in mind the industry's concerns or the user's concerns or the prevalent technology standards, because this is a new technology area where standards are evolving very rapidly. So should all those things have been taken into consideration, and then the norms being enforced. Now, what has happened now is the automotive industry is saying that, how can I operate that system? The battery makers are saying, oh, maybe I may. Actually, one company told Business Standard that he will consider winding up his business. Now, so therefore, a regulatory standard must keep in mind the practical challenges and difficulties of doing business without, is one thing to say that I want my country to be environmentally safe. Of course, everybody should do that, but there was no harm in taking industry's concern on board and see in what way the same goals can be achieved without causing the kind of disruption that now those rules are threatening to create.
Is anybody taking care of the economic consequences of these policies or these regulations that these guys create? Is there any consultative mechanism?
I think, there are institutions, there are bodies, the regulators are supposed to do that. There are ministries which are involved. And I'm sure, I'm reasonably hopeful that this will also be sorted out. But in the interim, what happens is a lot of uncertainty is caused. And in a globally competitive environment, what happens is that fresh investments take a hit. So a foreign investor or even a domestic investor starts thinking twice before committing his or her capital in this country, because say, listen, they are framing policies in this manner that I don't want to keep my money here. I will rather invest my money in a country where I know my investment is not subject to these fluctuating fortunes.
So maybe the policy papers need to focus as much on the cost of compliance as they do on probably the policy objective itself.
Oh, absolutely.
Because if I'm going to be shot down by such policy, then I'm going to keep my capital hidden.
Yes,
and then we're going to have the same situation where private capex is not increasing.
Absolutely. Although of late, it seems that private capex is rising.
After a long while.
After a long while.
So AKB, I'm going to ask you a direct question here. Do regulators spend as much time thinking about the cost of compliance as they spend on thinking of the policy itself?
I think regulators should worry more about compliance. And I think the regulators probably are not taking as important. No, I think regulators are not taking adequate feedback on board before they frame their regulations or regulatory policies.
We just talked about a lot about regulation and compliance and the burden it places on industry and companies. There is one thing which completed 9 years yesterday, and that is the goods and services tax, also known as the good and simple tax.
Yeah.
And maybe it's a good time to analyze how that well-intentioned reform has played out over the last 9 years. And a lot of the industry people or the companies or even individual entrepreneurs will tell you that compliance burden in GST is a bit of a problem.
Yes, of course, it is a problem. And I would say that we talked about the bureaucracy. Again, I would say that bureaucracy is partly responsible. The GST, when it was launched in 2017, everybody talked about grand bargain. What was a grand bargain then? The grand bargain was that the states will be protected their revenue. I think it was 14% growth that would be protected for 5 years. So states don't need to worry about, because states were saying, I will lose revenue and therefore everything. So at that time, it was considered to be the grand bargain. It was a clincher, and then the states agreed, signed on the paper, and GST. But there was another grand bargain which was struck, which nobody talks about. That grand bargain was with the bureaucracy. The state level bureaucracy said, what will happen to the large number of inspectors, civil servants who are just involved in excise, sales tax and everything? What will they do if it becomes a single tax, good and simple tax? So even though we came out with, replacing over a dozen taxes into one tax, we continued to maintain the same set of the departments, whether it was the union government's Central Board of Excise and Customs, CBEC, which later on became CBIT, indirect taxes, and at the state level, excise departments and the sales tax departments. There was some sort of an allocational responsibility was this thing. So you have, for SGST, you have to deal with the state bureaucracy. For CGST, you would deal with the central bureaucracy. And for the IGST, you have to deal with both. Now, this was to my mind a grand bargain that nobody talks about. And if you are asking this question, that has the compliance burden been reduced? I think compliance burden could have been reduced much faster. It has been reduced to some extent because instead of paying 12 taxes, you are paying only one tax. So compliance burden has come down. But the compliance burden would have come down even more if you had streamlined the bureaucracy that is involved in the collection of GST. That, to my mind, is once again a sign that how the government, the political leadership, and the civil servants have actually have seen to each other's interest and preserved the status quo in that sense. I think that if that were handled properly, GST's implementation would have been even better.
You know, in the run-up to when GST was launched, the debate was, or the arguments in favor were that, it was going to reduce the tax brackets, which was a major talking point. The other was also that it would reduce friction. The argument made was that you would have to spend less time understanding taxes or dealing with the tax bureaucracy, and you could spend more time running a business. Now, 9 years later, 9 years after GST was launched, has it actually become simpler for businesses, or has it become easier for the government rather than the taxpayers?
It has certainly helped the government more than the taxpayers. In a sense that the businesses have benefited because tax rates have also come down since September. The compliance system is better now. Technology has helped. Government's collections have been easier. But for the taxpayers, I think a lot more should flow in. And what I understand that the input tax credit problem, which is getting sorted out, and if it gets sorted out over the next 6, 7, 8 months, then I think the companies, the enterprises will also have a huge benefit, and the taxpayer will also gain as a result.
Would you say the GST has been an economic success?
I think on the whole, it has been economic success, but it could have been far better if some of those issues that we discussed had been handled more wisely.
Do you think GST has been an administrative success?
I don't think it has been an administrative success the way it was intended to be. Frankly speaking, there should have been an integrated administration system for GST. Although the registration, the process of GST is centralized, but the administrative part of SGST and CGST is still falling under two different heads. And for a company which is paying both CGST and SGST, will have to deal with two different departments.
If you were to talk to entrepreneurs, they don't complain about GST as an idea. They complain about it as a system. They are always complaining about compliance, filings, changing rules, notifications, and interpretations which they have to fight out. So maybe it's not GST itself, but how GST has evolved over the years. Is that a fair observation?
Well, I think, any tax structure like GST would have raised expectations. They're legitimate expectations, but I think the expectations were much higher, and what GST could deliver is not what the expectations were. And that is because it was, and administratively, it was not handled as well as it could have been.
Governments and businesses probably look at it differently. governments may say, they may ask the bureaucracy or the administration, has compliance increased? While businesses, for them, the biggest question probably is, has compliance become easier? And those aren't necessarily the same questions. And this is where probably the gap lies.
Well, I would say that compliance is like a coin, where you have to keep in mind both sides of the coin. For the businesses, compliance has to be easier, but enforcing that compliance requires administrative efficiency, administrative sensitivity, and use of technology, which the government has done. The tax administrative as you have done, but my only problem is the manner in which the separation of administration of the GST and CGST has gone about. It's time that some durable solution was found.
So what was this GST reform trying to achieve? Was it trying to maximize revenue, or was it trying to minimize friction? And probably this is conflict.
It was making the tax system more simple. And I think to that extent, doing away with more than a dozen taxes and bringing it down to one tax, the payment of the tax on an online basis, I think it is definitely helped. A large number of small, tiny companies may have been inconvenienced, but then for that there was an exemption. I think it's a good beginning, but a lot more remains to be done.
So maybe GST shouldn't be looked at as just a tax reform. It was probably a reform about how the business side interacts with the Indian state.
Yes, absolutely. I couldn't agree with you more on that.
And everything that we've discussed today, whether it is the IAS, GST, quality control orders,
they're at the heart of it.
Yeah, they're all boiling down to how the Indian state interacts with the economy.
Absolutely.
And maybe it's a good question to ask, who really runs the Indian economy? And this is at the heart of everything that we do.
Well, as I said, it's a combination of the political leadership and the civil service, and both contribute to each other. And I think, to be fair, the current government has tried to reform the bureaucracy, but with very, very limited outcomes.
So, has the Indian state liberalized the economy faster than it has liberalized how the state interacts with the economy?
I think there is a very valid question. The Indian state over the last 35 years has liberalized the economy at a much faster rate, had put in place new systems at a much faster pace, but where it has lacked is the way those reformed systems have to be implemented and enforced.
So we do see that private enterprises flourish. There are bigger Indian companies now competing globally, but the state seems to have found a different way of exercising control over these arms of the economy.
That's because we haven't really handled the problem of how do we reform the civil services. And when I say civil services, I'm not just talking about civil services at the top end. It is the bureaucracy as such.
So if we were to become a developed country in the future, should we focus less on liberalizing markets and more on liberalizing the Indian state then?
I think both. Both are very, very important. You cannot do one and believe that the other will automatically follow. No, it doesn't. You have to liberalize the markets, you have to liberalize industry. At the same time, you have to liberalize the way you are running your government.
If India wants to become a developed country soon, what is this one reform that you want the government to undertake over the next decade?
I think the government will have to ensure that reform benefits should not be that only growth takes place, but along with growth comes with a kind of an equitable distribution of those resources which enhance the vibrancy, the resilience of the economy, and which is what I meant is that the government must make sure that while liberalizing the economy, you must also ensure that your key areas, which are irrigation, health, education, and therefore jobs, they are taken care of.
If you were to look back at former RBI governors who were professionals and experts in their field, once they left RBI, they went back to universities to teach.
Many of them.
Maybe the IAS cadre also needs a teaching sinecure rather than corporate positions.
Well, I don't know. I mean, it is not that some civil servants haven't done that, but I would say that the process should begin not by sending them to education institutions. Process should begin by ensuring, and the government has a role to play, that ensuring that the entire system of governance is thrown open and does not become a preserve of only the civil servants who come from the Indian Administrative Service.
AKB, that was a lovely discussion. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
And thank you for watching. Today's discussion wasn't really about the IAS, GST, or quality control orders. Those were simply windows into a much larger question. 35 years after the 1991 reforms, India has built a far more open and competitive economy. The next challenge may be ensuring that India's institutions evolve just as rapidly as its economy has. The question isn't whether India needs regulation. Every modern economy does. The real question is whether we have found the right balance between an effective state and an enabling state. As India aspires to become a developed country, getting that balance right may matter just as much as the next generation of economic reforms. I am Ankur Bharadwaj. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in 2 weeks on Macro Matters.